So let's talk about a concept that is sometimes referred to as break even. The technical term in microeconomics is zero economic profit, but we're going to use this sort of slang term, this break even. All right, what is break even? Break even is a financial situation in which a firm is experiencing $0 in profit. Now, I admit that that sounds terrible because if you start a business and your income as the business owner is going to be the profit from the business, that earning zero income does not sound good at all. In fact, if somebody told you, hey, if you start this business, you will always have no more than zero profit, I can see why you would say, you know what, I'm not interested, I don't want to start that business. But I actually owned a business for a few years, and I have to tell you that break even, zero economic profit is actually a really nice situation when, for a year and a half right after you started the business, you were actually experiencing negative profit. It took us a long time to build up our customer base and to develop our business systems so that we were earning enough revenue just to cover our costs, okay? So for us, when we reached break even, it was a celebratory time. We were excited. See, when you're experiencing negative profit, if your profit is less than zero, then you have to write checks out of your personal savings into the business so that you can keep it going and keep it growing until you finally get to break even. Then, once you've gotten to the break even point, you can then keep growing the business and you can have positive profit. And so for a long time, at first, this is the problem of fixed costs, is that when you first open a business, you automatically owe money, but you have a quantity of zero production, zero sales. And so you're going to work yourself up from a loss, negative profit, up until you finally get to break even. And then after break even, you can start to enjoy positive profits, okay? So profit equal, zero profit is not the ideal, and it's not fun, and it's not what you want to be the normal result of your business. But when profit is zero, loss is also zero, and that's very nice if you spent a lot of time running your business with a loss. So let me show you how this, why it's so important to try and understand, hey, when are we going to break even? We know that profit is equal to total revenue minus total cost. And suppose that quantity is equal to zero. Well, under what circumstance? The day you open your business, the first minute you are open, your quantity is zero. So let's go ahead and put a zero in for quantity. First of all, we know that total revenue is the same thing as price times quantity. And we know that total cost is the same thing as variable cost plus fixed cost. And so if we put a zero in for quantity right here, we have price times zero. And remember that when quantity is zero, variable cost also equals zero. So we'll have a zero in here for variable cost. Well, price times zero is zero, and zero plus fixed cost equals fixed cost. So our profit is going to be equal to zero minus fixed cost, which is negative fixed costs. And therefore, if our profit is automatically the negative of whatever we invested in our fixed costs, so like in my business, we invested $250,000. So on day one, our profit was negative $250,000. So you can imagine how excited we were when we went up to zero, okay? So when its profit is negative, remember, we don't call it profit, we call it loss. And so this brings up a very important question that you'll probably ask frequently as a business owner. I'm operating at a loss because of the problem of fixed costs. I'm trying to recover my fixed costs, but even as my quantity increases, as my sales increase, I'm having to cover my variable costs first. Then, if anything is left over, I can put it towards my fixed costs. Then, if anything is left over, I can keep some of it as profit. So it brings up a really important question. When am I going to break even? What is my break-even point? And so as you start thinking about that, because you want to stop writing checks out of your personal savings, you start to wonder, well, how can I understand this point of break even? And that's where we're going to move on to next. So here are two ways that we can understand break even. Okay? These are two questions that we might ask ourselves as we're running our business, as we're trying to understand when are we going to stop losing money and when can we start earning some profit. Okay? We can understand break even as a quantity, and I call it break even quantity, and to represent it we'll say Q sub BE. So this is break even quantity. Break-even quantity, very simply, is the number of units that must be produced and sold to earn $0 in profit. Okay? We're going to see a formula for this in just a little bit. Okay? But we can ask the question, well, we've been doing business here for about a year and we're still operating at a loss. Well, how many of these things do we have to sell? What quantity do we have to sell before we finally break even? Okay? That's the break-even quantity. We can also ask the question in terms of total revenue, the break-even total revenue, or TR sub BE, break-even total revenue. Okay? That is the amount of money, the amount a firm must earn in total revenue in order for profit to equal $0. Okay, so we're going to ask the question, well, how much money do we have to earn in sales before we finally break even? Okay, well, that would be break-even total revenue. And here's the thing, we know that total revenue is related to quantity. We know that total revenue is equal to price times quantity. So break-even total revenue is going to be equal to price times break-even quantity. And so this is the first formula that you should have in your notes that will help you to understand the idea of break-even total revenue and the idea of break-even quantity. And now what we're going to do is we're going to look at a couple other equations that are important within the concept of zero economic profit or break-even. All right, so we're going to do a little bit of math here, namely algebra. And what we're going to do is we're going to try and understand break-even or zero economic profit sort of with three different equations. We're going to begin with something we already know, that profit is equal to total revenue minus total cost, and we're going to impose some facts that we know about break-even or zero economic profit in a firm to help us sort of identify three equations that will help us either understand break-even today or maybe in a later lesson, maybe in a later unit in microeconomics. Okay, so here's what we're going to say. We know that profit is equal to total revenue minus total cost. There's the profit equation. And we know that zero economic profit means that profit is equal to zero. So if profit was zero, then zero would equal total revenue minus total cost. And now, if we just manipulate this algebraically and add total cost to both sides, we can see very simply, this is the first way we're going to understand zero economic profit, okay? Is zero plus total cost is total cost, and that's equal to total revenue, and this cancels over here. And so we can see that total cost is equal to total revenue. So, and I prefer to say it actually as total revenue is equal to total cost, but it doesn't really matter either way. So this is the first way. I want you to sort of highlight this. This is the first important way that we want to understand break even. It's the place in the business where the total revenue is equal to the total cost. And so what does that mean? That means that the revenue that we're earning is exactly equal to the costs that we are paying out. We are just covering all of our variable and our fixed costs with all of our revenues, okay? We actually saw that in the example when we talked about the problem of fixed costs, okay? All right, so now let's take this and sort of understand in another way. So we're going to begin now with total revenue is equal to total cost. Now we know that total revenue is the same thing as price times quantity, and so we can say that that break even is also when price times quantity is equal to total cost, okay? Now, if we were to divide both sides by quantity, over here we would cancel quantity, and all we would have left is price. So price equals, and if you recall, when we talked about all the different variables, financial variables for a firm, we learned that total cost divided by quantity is the same thing as average total cost. So this is the second way that we want to understand break-even analysis or zero economic profit. And in a later lesson, in another unit, this is actually going to become very important. We're not going to talk about this for several weeks. We're done talking about it right now, but I want you to know that this is going to come back. There's going to be a lesson where we're going to talk about the importance of understanding a firm's decisions and their profit maximization and their loss minimization based on the relationship between the price that the firm is charging and the average total costs of the firm. And when price is equal to average total cost, automatically that means that that firm is earning zero economic profit or that firm is breaking even, okay? And now for the third way that we're going to understand break even, we're going to have to do a bit of algebra. All right, for this third one, what we're basically going to do is we're going to develop a formula that you can use to be able to answer some homework problems. Now, if you really don't want to bear through all this algebra, you could skip ahead a few minutes and just get straight to the final formula, and that's fine. Okay, but I am going to prove it. I am going to prove this formula, and we're going to start with what we already know, that if the firm is experiencing zero economic profit or if the firm is breaking even, then their total revenue is equal to total cost. And we know that if total revenue is equal to total cost, then that must mean that this must be the break-even total revenue, okay? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to break both of these out. We know that total revenue, break-even total revenue, is the same thing as price times break-even quantity. And we know that total cost is the same thing as variable cost plus fixed costs, okay? And what we're going to do next is we're going to subtract variable cost. We're going to get fixed cost by itself, but only temporarily. We're going to subtract variable cost over here, and we're going to subtract variable cost over here. Over here, it's going to cancel. And what we're now going to have is price times break-even quantity minus variable cost is equal to fixed costs. Okay. Now, one of the things that we learned previously is that variable cost can also be understood as average variable cost times quantity. Okay. So, because average variable cost is variable cost divided by quantity, if we multiply by quantity on both sides, we get variable cost is the same thing as average variable cost times quantity. So that's what I'm going to do here to variable cost. So we're going to have price times break-even quantity minus average variable cost times break-even quantity, because quantity is the same thing in this problem because it's the break-even point. Okay, so average variable cost times break-even quantity is the variable cost that's within this particular total cost, okay? And then that's equal to fixed cost. Now we're going to do a fun algebraic maneuver, which I love and all math people love, but it's not one that's sort of familiar to everybody all the time. What we're going to do is we're going to factor out this break-even quantity. We're going to move it over here, and we're going to put parentheses around price minus AVC, okay? It's called factoring out. So we're going to factor out break-even quantity, and we're going to have price minus average variable cost, and that's going to be equal to fixed cost, okay? And now what we're solving for here is actually break-even quantity. We want to know how can we calculate our break-even quantity if we know some financial information about the firm. And so in order to solve for break-even quantity, we're going to divide by price minus AVC on both sides. Price minus AVC on both sides. Over here, these are going to cancel, and all we have left is break-even quantity is equal to fixed costs divided by price minus AVC. And now, if you saw the video on the problem of fixed cost, you saw this already as an example, because we calculated the quantity that needed to be sold in order to recover our fixed costs after our price was covering our average variable cost. And at that time, fixed cost in that example, in that previous video, fixed cost was $5,000, price was $10, and average variable cost was $4, and we wound up with $5,000 divided by 6, which was 833.33, which we rounded to 834. So the break-even quantity in that video where we talked about the problem of fixed costs, we didn't mention break-even quantity, but that's essentially what was going on. The break-even quantity in that situation was 834 t-shirts. And then after that, any t-shirts that were sold above 834 would contribute to a positive profit, okay? And so this is our formula right here that we're going to use, and we're going to do some examples in the next video where we use this formula to be able to calculate our break-even quantity. Now, why is this useful? How can a business benefit from this formula? Well, most business owners that are involved in their business, they know their fixed costs. They know what they have spent or what they still owe to cover all of their capital costs. They know what they're selling their product for. They know their price, and they know what their on average what their cost per unit is for materials. And so all they have to do is take these three pieces of information and they can calculate how many they need to sell before they reach zero economic profit. And then after that, they begin profiting.